Welcome to the Provocative Lecture Series hosted by the Department of Economics at San Jose State University. My name is Matt Holian, and as the chair of the department, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event titled, Why the Study of Economics Neglects Race and What Can Be Done About It. The Provocative Lecture Series fosters the tradition in higher education of challenging ideas and developing critical thinking in an environment of respect and intellectual discourse on controversial topics. Presenters in the Provocative Lecture Series are noted for their outstanding scholarship and public speaking ability, and tonight's speaker, Professor Gary Hoover, is no exception. Students and faculty, the general public are all invited. Tonight's lecture will be recorded and shared on social media. Speaking of social media, please follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @EconSJSU, and you can find a link to it in the chat bar now, or in a few minutes, we'll repost those. Please follow us. A few other logistics. I have pasted a link to a virtual sign-in sheet in chat. If your professor is giving extra credit for attending tonight's event, you may use it to record your attendance. There are other links in the chat too on the history of SJSU and some of our alums. Normally, after this lecture, we'd adjourn to a local eatery to continue the conversation in a less formal environment. Of course, that's not possible tonight, but our new virtual format does present new opportunities. Please feel free to share your reactions with fellow attendees in the chat during the talk. The speaker will not be able to monitor them, but you will have the opportunity to ask questions in Q&A at the end of the talk. Please save questions until the end and post them to Q&A, not chat. The virtual background you see behind me tonight is an image from our main campus in San Jose, California. The statue is of two SJSU students, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who won gold and bronze medals at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. Upon receiving their medals, they raised their fist to protest racism and injustice, and their call reverberated around the world. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I wanted to say a few words about the origins of tonight's event. This event is designed to help change the study of economics. It is one way SJSU continues to answer the call made all those years ago by John Carlos and Tommy Smith. I can tell you from my own experience that the economics profession has not adequately addressed these topics. Last year, I was finishing a book on contemporary social controversies. 2020 was quite a year to be writing such a book, as social events dramatically unfolded throughout the year. After the killing of George Floyd in May of 2020 and the resulting BLM protests, I considered whether my own book adequately addressed racism. I easily saw that it did not. My book is on economic studies using the American Community Survey data. I therefore searched the literature for studies of race and discrimination that I could include in the book, but I found very few. This experience also made me recognize that I have a lot to learn myself, and I'm looking forward to learning from tonight's speaker. I'm honored to introduce Professor Gary Hoover, who is known to friends and colleagues as Hoove. Gary Hoover is the executive director of the Murphy Institute at Tulane University, where he is also professor of economics. From 2015 to 2020, he was a presidential professor and the chair of economics department at the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Hoover received his Ph.D. in economics from Washington University in St. Louis. Since then, he has published numerous scholarly research papers in journals like American Economic Review, Papers and Proceedings, Journal of Economic Perspectives, and Public Choice. He is also the co-chair of the American Economic Association Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economics Profession, and he has served as vice president of the Southern Economic Association. Dr. Hoover is the founding and current editor of the Journal of Economics, Race, and Policy. He has been a visiting scholar at the University of Vienna. Hoove, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to give this lecture tonight. I know you can't monitor the chat right now, but I'd like to ask all participants to make a little noise in chat right now to welcome Hoove to San Jose State.
Well, thank you, everybody. I hope that you can hear me, and I shall try to be provocative, but also be informative. So I want to thank you all for inviting me to the talk. And I also want to say that the fact that we're doing this virtually does not at all release you from your obligation to have me there in person. Because I want to come to beautiful San Jose as opposed to freezing cold home where I am now in my kitchen. With that, let's dig into a little bit of stuff. I got a lot of stuff I want to talk to you about. And I'm going to share my screen some. I'm going to come back here a bit face to face. I am going to also take you to a couple of links. We're going to walk around and we're going to take a look at some things. So with that, let me share my screen and we'll begin. Okay, so let me take this to full view and we can see. Why do we need to have race introduced naturally? And notice I have naturally in parentheses here into course curriculum principles of economics. I say naturally because just as what Matt was pointing out, there's no reason to have a special chapter and say, okay, this is the chapter on race, or this is where we can finally talk about it. It actually fits sort of everywhere in economics, and there are portions of it where it fits more naturally than others. And that's what some of these charts come from. So I got this chart from the American Economics Association Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the econ profession, because our main association recognizes we have a problem, right? Look at this. Degrees awarded in economics, and this was in the 2018-2019 school year. What jumps out to me is something along the lines of here, right? Look at BAs, and this is where most of you folks are, right? 32,000 BAs were issued in that year in economics, and about a little bit less than 1,700 of those went to Blacks, right? Making up 5.6%. That's a low number, right? And it's even low when we look at minorities in general. If we just say all minorities, we're still at 17.5%, not very high. You'll see that the MA number is a little bit higher. That's a quirk that happens when you include MBAs, right? Because some people go on to get their MBAs, and that can be counted if you have an MBA with a concentration in economics. What that corresponds to is, look down here, PhDs, because the PhDs are where your professors are going to come from, right? In that year, 2018, 2019, there were 13 Blacks, absolutely zero American Indian or Native Alaskan, zero. These numbers are staggering. So that's why we need to have this discussion. One of the things we've learned is that when students are studying a field where they don't see themselves fitting into the curriculum, then this isn't anything that they want to pursue. So that's how we end up with numbers that look like this. So let me go to the next page and show you this. Interesting here. Here are degrees awarded to minorities in science, technology, engineering, math, otherwise known as STEM. Because one of the arguments we would hear is, well, you know what, these minorities and Blacks in particular, they don't have the mathematical skills, they don't have the analytics skills to pull this thing off. Well, here are those who have the math and analytics skills that we were talking about. And look at here, right? There are more Black/African Americans, and this is a true fact. There are more Blacks majoring in pure mathematics than there are in economics. How can that be? How can it be that a field as rich and inviting as economics could have so few people of color in it? You know, all across. If you look at all of these numbers right here, remember that number was 0, right, when it was econ. Remember this number. This number in that same year was 0, right? And look here, we end up with 66 getting PhDs in STEM fields. So there's clearly a disconnect, right? There's something that's happening that is, let me see if I can go back. Yeah, here's the one we were looking at before. There's that 0 PhDs that I was talking about for American Indian or / Native Alaskan. These numbers are just low, 5.6%. We go down here and we look at STEM, we see 6.5%. All of the numbers are higher in STEM, right? The numbers are higher in STEM than they are in econ. Yeah, problematic. So how does that translate then is, let's look at this. Representation of Black, Hispanic, and minority groups in the economics faculty. And there's a lot going on here, right? Tenure and tenure track, non-tenure track totals and all of that stuff. But let's just take a look at me. So I am a full professor and I am Black. So I would be here under the full professor column, and this first group is Black. So 2% of full professors, oh no, I'm wrong, sorry. 1.7%. 1.7% of full professors in the economics field are Black. That is horrible. That's a very, very low number, right? And looking across the board, because we've got 3 categories, right? We've got associate professors, and we've got full professors, and then we've got others. And if we look right here, and we looked at full-time, 2%. That's the number really that we should care about, that 2% or this 2%. So it's no surprise then that when people don't see themselves mentioned in the curriculum, when people don't see the field being inviting, that then they don't pursue this into higher education beyond just a BA, and then they don't become professors. And then this thing just sort of perpetuates itself, right? So we don't have faculty of color, students don't see themselves in the field, they don't do it, and then we don't have faculty in color. So this circle seems to continue around and around. Not good at all. So what is the slide saying here? Therefore, the problem lies within the economics profession itself, and it's mostly a byproduct of how it's presented in these principles classes. Because, why do we care about the principles classes in particular, and why am I focusing on that? Because I don't know how it is at San Jose, but at most universities, almost every incoming student has to take either principles of microeconomics or principles of macroeconomics. No matter what you're majoring in, you're going to be touched by principles of micro and macro. So it's really odd or disappointing that given that all of these students are basically going to have to go through economics, that economics has these, let me see if I can go back, that we have these low numbers, right? How is it that we end up with these low numbers here, given that so many students have to take economics, right? They're forced, well, I guess forced is too strong a word, but they have to fill out their general education requirements and they're taking these courses, and then they don't end up sticking in economics. Well, this is a byproduct of something that's going on in principles. And that's what I'm going to, let me see how I'm doing on time. Okay. That's what I want to spend a little time talking to you about. And hopefully we'll get a good Q&A going on the backside of this. So one problem that I see is the use of this term rationality. And I don't know how many of you folks are in principles or will soon be, but this is going to be a term that's going to come up, rationality in our instruction, which means that everyone is rational agents and they're either out to maximize utility or they're out to maximize profits. And therefore, there is no room to talk about race, to talk about discrimination, to talk about racism. This is what economics says, which says, hey, you know what? It just won't exist. Why? Because let's look at a definition of consumer equilibrium. And all of you who are in principles classes right now, you're probably rolling your eyes, or you see this definition later. You say, oh, I remember this one. A consumer equilibrium is a situation in which a consumer has allocated all his or her available income in the way that given prices and goods and services maximize his or her total utility. That's it. Where in there did it talk about race-based preferences? You didn't see it at all, right? Where in there did it say that sometimes there is employer discrimination? Nothing. It says that a consumer, the only thing he or she cares about is maximizing utility given prices and, well, it should say income. Yeah, available income and prices, right? Or let's look at it from the firm side. We assume that firms choose output or price so as to maximize profit. If the firm fails to maximize its profit, it is either eliminated or bought out by other firms seeking to maximize profit. Where did I get these two definitions from? These were the two definitions that were in the textbooks that I teach from, which I had to augment because this wasn't enough. Look at what this says here, and this is what most of us are taught, right? Or what we are teaching. We say, look, the goal of the firm is to maximize its profits. If the firm fails to maximize its profits, it is either eliminated or bought out by others seeking to maximize profits. Once again, there is no place in here that you see to talk about race, to talk about discrimination, to talk about any of these things, because as I was taught when I was a freshman and I was in principles of economics, look, consumers want to maximize utility, firms want to maximize profits, end of story, that's it. And I'm looking and I'm saying, well, that seems rather odd because in my real life interactions with people and my real life interactions with firms, there seems to be other things that we could be discussing. You know what I was told? No, this is it. And even when I went on to pursue a PhD, I said, hey, you know what? I think I want to do my PhD and I want to look at some of these things that I presume are going on. I said, nope, you're not seeing what you think you're seeing. I'm not. Right, because here are the definitions that we're going to work with. Okay, I got a problem with that. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at what you've seen. All right, so this is what we call the spaghetti graph, or at least I do when I'm teaching principles. And there's a lot going on here. For those of you who haven't had micro, or you had micro and it was a nightmare and you're trying to forget it, here are the only things you really need to worry about. You see this on my screen is orange. This $17 line that's going straight across, right? That's the line that the business can't do anything about. That line stays at $17 and you can't change it. Now, what you can change as a business is this one, and that's sort of, I don't know, what color would that be? Reddish on mine. Not quite reddish, but it looks sort of reddish on mine. This light blue one or this purple one. And so what I was taught was that that's the shutdown point. that if you can't take this AVC, when some of you should remember this, if you took principles, if not, it's going to be on your exam. Average variable cost line. Now remember, you can take this line, this marginal cost line, this average total cost line, this average variable cost line. You can manipulate these up or down. You can't do anything about this revenue line, right? That one is a straight line. That one you can't bother with. And so what we were always taught was, since you can manipulate these cost lines, all you want to do is try and drag these cost lines down as far as you can, right? Notice what I'm saying here. Notice what's missing here. A firm who cannot take this average variable cost line and drag it down to that $17, you see that dot right there? Any firm who cannot drag the purple line down to the $17 mark, it has to go out of business, right? It's done. At a minimum, that's why they call that the shutdown point. And the reason I wanted to spend this time and bore you with this is for one reason only. Nowhere in this discussion did you see race mentioned at all. So I was told as a freshman, when I looked at this graph, and when I was a graduate student, when I looked at this graph, and when I became a professor and I looked at this graph, that no firm is going to engage in any type of employer discrimination against its workers, because all it cares about is bringing that purple line down to the $17 mark, right? That goes along with what I just showed you before, that we assume that firms choose their price, in this case, or output, to maximize profits. That's it. And then to back up that statement, they would pull out this graph. Pull out this graph, and we were all told, so here's where I start to get provocative, where I say, that's not enough, right? This is an incomplete analysis, and our profession is guilty of that, right? We as economists. So now that we know what we've been told, let's look at some of the stuff that we haven't been told. Okay, but what if all things are not equal from the start? The premise that I just told you about before, that Trayvon Logan has done some work on Black sounding names, distinctively Black names in the American past. What this research shows, and what another paper shows that I also have too, is that when you apply for a job and your name sounds Black, that you don't even get a chance to be adequately evaluated. And that's what the Trayvon Logan paper showed. It said that, and I was going to read you the abstract, but it showed that sending in the same resume, the exact same resume with all of the same education, but just changing the name made a difference in how people were perceived and their employment opportunities. Yes, absolutely. What does that have? What does the sound of your name have to do with your employment? And where is that taken into account here when we said that firms only care about dropping down this cost? There's something wrong there. Also, that same work was done by these folks too a while ago, which looked at the changing of the names, exact same resume, changing of the names, and whether or not that made a difference, right? Let me see if I can, hopefully you're still seeing the screen here. Some research has shown, let me go back and make this full again. Okay. some research has shown that non-Black job applicants of equal ability receive 50% more callbacks than Blacks. That's not taken into account in that chart that I showed you above, right? Where's that in here when we're talking about employment? Not mentioned at all. Finally, oops, I keep skipping ahead. Technology is not doing me right tonight. Okay. Finally, some research has shown that Black males without criminal records receive the same rate of callbacks for interviews as white males just released from prison when applying for employment at the low wage job market, right? So for entry level employment, we find that Black males without a criminal record are getting about the same number of callbacks for interviews as white males with a recently released males from prison. We have to account for these things because these are the things that make economics more real to us if we're going to have real discussions about economics impacting policy, because that's what I see economics as doing. I see economics as being a way to inform policymakers about actually making policy that impacts people's lives. And if that's going to be the case, then we have to reevaluate that. We have to reevaluate this. We have to get more serious about whether or not this accurately reflects the world that we live in and whether or not these definitions accurately capture what's going on in our marketplace. Okay. After that snafu, let me take you into some of my own behavioral work. Now, behavioral economics, sometimes called experimental economics. I did an experiment where I used undergraduates, right? I do this experiment in a lot of my principles classes. Now, I don't tell them what's going on. I'm going to tell you what's going on now. But normally, they don't know any of this going in. They figure it out afterwards. So what do? We induce wealth and income differences between subjects to compare their behavior in a simple 2-period life cycle savings and consumption task. We also compare the impact of public information about the others' decisions on individual behavior in an investment task. Participants are assigned an initial wealth in dollars and an initial income in points. Participants decide whether to consume their entire income, thereby increasing the probability that they win a $10 prize, or to invest a portion of their income in a lottery that may yield an increased income, a future income, which they can consume. So that's the technical stuff. What's going on here is we separate the students, and they don't know that they're being separated, and we make some of them actually rather wealthy, and some of them are poor, and we say to them, hey, you know what you can do? You can take the income that I'm giving you now, where some of you are wealthy, some of you are poor, and you can walk out the door with it right now. Or you can invest it in your future, and then you'll have a chance to earn even more in the next period, right? If you stay in the room. So that's sort of like the decisions that you and I are asked to make about going to college, right? So think about it. There are rich people who want to go to college. There are poor people who want to go to college. And then they're saying to themselves, okay, some people are starting out with a lot more wealth than others, right? So we cover it for wealth. And we also do it for income, where some people are just having more income than others. And we say to them, hey, you know what? You could take this money that you've got in your hand right now, and you could invest it in college, which could give you a higher return in the future, right? There's no guarantee, but we believe that if you take this time to invest your money in a college education, that in the future, it will pay off for you. And so we also do this where people don't know whether or not they're rich or poor, right? And that's where the thing about public information comes in. So hopefully you're understanding what's going on here. I'm taking people and I'm artificially making college students rich and poor. At first, they don't even know whether or not they're in the rich and poor thing. And then I'm telling both of them, I'm telling them, hey, if you want, you can take what you got in your hand right now. You can walk out the door. There's your money. However, you could stay in the room, invest your money, and have a chance to get even more money in the future. Now, maybe you won't, but there's a chance that you could get more in the future. Okay, hopefully everyone understands the experimental design and what we do, because I do this in class. Okay, here's what I found out. With the case of income. Now, this is where they're separated by income. Actually, these are instructions that I give them. In this experiment, 1/2 of the people have a low income of 1 point, and 1/2 of the people have a high income of 3 points. That's about right? So the difference between rich and poor, we're going to say about 3 times more in income. Last week, another group of students made the same choices that you will make now. Over 80% of the people with low income chose to invest. Over 70% of people with high income chose to invest. Of those who chose to invest, 23% of the people low income and 64% of the high income people got the extra money. So what do we mean by the 23 and 64? Remember I told you there was a chance that if you hung around and you invested your money that you could get a bigger payoff in the future. Well, what this is saying for the low income people, 23% of them got the payoff. 64% of the high income people got the extra payoff. They invested, and those are the numbers. Now, when we did it for wealth, it's the same thing, right? Wealth, they started out, I gave them $7 and $21. And they did the same thing. They could either hang around, walk out the door with the $7, walk out the door with the $21, or hang around and invest and see whether or not they could get even more money in the future. So what ended up happening with them right here, of those who chose to invest, 35% of the low income people, who did hang around, they actually ended up getting the extra money. And 23% of the high income people who hung around actually ended up getting the money. Am I reading that right? Yeah. Yep. And 23% of the high income. So what does that look like in a graph? And the only thing that really matters here is this. I was debating whether or not I should have put this chart in here at all. Here's what I want you to see. The rich are the dashed line. That's the dashed line, the rich right here. And the only line I really care about is this black one, right? Look, when they did not know that they were rich or poor, most people acted exactly the same. But when I put them into the experiment and they knew that they were either rich or poor, look what happened to the poor. The poor started investing in their future a lot less. See that line going down? Now, remember, the black line is the only one we really care about here. So what's happening here is when you put these people together and you let them see each other, and you let them see the inequality, you let them see how unfair it is, the poor are more likely to say, forget it, I'm out. The rich, who are already rich, are more likely to say, wow, I'm rich, and I could be even richer. Look at what happens to them. Now, when it comes to the wealth, just pay attention to this black line here and see if you're watching what's happening here, right? Remember, the black dash line are the rich people. The rich people drop off on their investment. Now, this is people who are rich with wealth, right? And this was people who are rich in income. So hopefully you've got that sorted out. But look who dropped off the most. Look at that black line. Look at the drop. Look at the drop for the poor, right? And look at the drop, the dash line for the rich. The poor absolutely were more willing to invest in their future when they did not know they were poor. This matters. So every time we're showing poor people and we're showing these, when people realize how far they are from their colleagues, right, and other people in society, basically what you're walking away from here is inequality matters. Look at what you can get people to invest in. Both of them invested in their future about the same. That's what baseline means. Baseline meant they didn't know that they were rich or poor. But and observe means they did get to observe when they were rich or poor. Wow. They won't invest in their futures. This is what economics can do. Economics can help us to show. People ask all the time, they say, well, look, if it's true that the key to getting ahead is to think about college and to think about your future, then what is going on with these different groups? Part of it is observation, knowing where they are in the income distribution and knowing that I want to go back one page. Let me see if I can go back one page. I want to show you something right here. Notice what happens here. If you're successful in your investment, you're going to get $10 extra. So a poor person already had 7. If they were successful in their investment in college, they were going to get an extra 10. That meant at most, they were going to get $17. But look, a rich person was starting out at 21 in my experiment. I did this on purpose so that a poor person investing in his or her future was never even going to catch a rich person who did nothing. A rich person was always going to be better off. And once these people realized that, they gave up. The same thing's going on when I did this experiment up here with the income thing. Once people saw that the inequality was so high that it could never be breached, they gave up. That's important. That's the power of econ, which I would like for us to talk about. This is what I think matters in econ, and these are the types of things I do in my class because this is powerful right here. Well, at least to me, but I'm an econ nerd. Okay, I've wasted a lot of your time. Let me move on to this one. This is another graph I show in my class. Okay, hopefully everyone has an idea of what the median income is. Median means in the United States, half of us are above this and half of us are below this, right? That's what the line, you should see a line here. It looks like it's right at 50,000. It's not, it's actually a bit above it. But on this graph, it looks like it's there, but it doesn't really matter. Just remember, if you want to be above the line, remember, median means half of the people are below, half are above. Then one of the things that puts you on the above and the half that's above is a bachelor's degree. And hopefully that's what all of you folks are doing. You're at the above part because you're working on your bachelor's degrees, and that's good. And in class, we talk about that. We say, hey, that's good. We talk about the type of householder. If you want to be on the half above, there are household differences. There are age of household differences. And here's where people don't talk about it. And this is where, in my class, we begin. Look at this. Race matters. Remember that experiment I just did? You're already, Black and Hispanics are before anything else, before we ever added in education, type of household, age, or region, Blacks and Hispanics were already below the median line, and whites and Asians were above. And remember what happens when you see those differences and you see those differences as being too far. This is a discussion that needs to happen because Gary Hoover, me, I'm not going to be able to answer all of the questions. So I need people like you to get your degrees and get into this profession and start doing this research, start trying to help to find answers to this. Look at this. This is exactly like the experiment I was talking about, that from the start, before we do anything else, if we were to take away this, take away this, take away this, take away that, that's where we'd be starting from. Now, of course, we can do things to manipulate these things, like we can take a Black person and then give them a doctorate. That'll help. We can take a Black person and put them in the 45 to 54 category and put them as a male householder, no wife present. That seems to be helpful. Or that might be below. I don't have my glasses on. But as we see, these types of discussions happen. And I don't know if in intermediate, micro or macro, or principles of micro or macro at San Jose State, if you've seen this graph. And in your principles classes, if you have not, I want you to demand of your faculty members that they include this discussion. I've just put the faculty of San Jose State on, I've just thrown them under the bus. Okay, I did it. Sorry about that. But students demand to have these discussions going forward. Okay, because all of this matters. All of this discussion absolutely makes a difference because you know what? We all are in this society together. Another thing I do in my class is lots of times, since we saw the numbers are so low, and it is conceivable that a student could go through college and never had a person of color as a faculty member at all. One thing we have at the American Economics Association is a list of profiles of people of color who are professional economists, right? So here is Dr. Nada Issa. She is at Georgetown University. And if you folks want, you can go here and read up about her because maybe you're not going to have a person of color in your econ department to teach a class to you or to tell you about their research. That's no problem. Here, right down the street from you folks at UCLA is Randall Aqui, right? Now he is Native American and he's at UCLA. And what's really interesting about these profiles is these profiles are not just about the research they do. It talks about how they went from there to here. So look at the first sentence here. Growing up in a single parent household in the sugarcane plantation town in Hawaii, right, where money was tight. And now this guy was raised by a single parent and now he's a professor of economics at UCLA. That's a story worth reading about and knowing about. Let's see who else we have here. We have Derek Hamilton at the New School. Look at his gigantic melon head. Well, okay. I only say that because I'm actually good friends with Derek, but he really does have a gigantic melon head. But we can read his story, right? And we can see, that's interesting. How did this person end up being an economist, right? We've got Caroline Hoxby. She is across the bay from you when this was written. Oh yeah, she's at Stanford, right? So, men, women of all colors. Here's Mark Hugo. So normally what I do in my class is I want my students to go through one of these mini lists, right? And I say to them, hey, just go through here, find someone that interests you and read about them, right? Read about someone that is actually still living and does work and someone who can speak to you. Because lots of times in our classes, right, the only name we ever hear is Adam Smith. Yep, there's other economists besides Adam Smith. So, important. I think that this is important and that you should take a look. Remember we were talking about Trayvon Logan and the paper on black sounding names? Well, I just saw his name here. I just saw Trayvon somewhere. Let's see if I can find it. No, I just saw his name. There he is right here. Okay. Here's the guy who wrote that paper on the black sounding names that I just referenced before, right? And about his story and how he ended up as an economist and what he has added to the field. Okay, I see that I'm running out of time here. I just got one more thing I want to show you folks. I want all of you undergraduates to know that the AEA, the American Economics Association, has initiatives for diversity and inclusion. And one of the things that we have, there's 5 awards here, but one of them I want to show you and talk about is the Andrew Brimmer Undergraduate Essay Prize. Pay attention here, folks. This guy, Aladdin, from the University of Northern Iowa, won this award in 2020. For 2021, this can be one of you, right? It's an undergraduate prize. Look at the criteria. You have to write a 750-word essay, right, on the economic well-being of Black Americans, right? You have to get a letter from your department chair, an endorsement letter from your department chair. And the deadline is, you're going to send that in September of this year. And I think this thing comes with a money prize too. Let's see. Oh, look at this, folks. All of you undergrads, $1,000 and a plaque. Undergraduate prize on Andrew Brimmer, who was the first Black governor in the Federal Reserve System. They've named a prize after him. You can read up about this, all of you undergraduates. This is fantastic stuff. And I'm gonna share my screen one last time. And then I am going to shut up because I've absolutely gone over, and I apologize for that, but I got to run in my mouth. I'll share my screen one last time. Talked about the award for undergraduates. We talked about the minority economist. I got one last thing to say here, and that one won't come up, but there it is right there. Here's my provocative idea that economists should actually use economics. What? Economists should actually use economics. Crazy idea. What we know in economics is incentives matter. The reason why we haven't seen more race discussed in classes is because you folks haven't pressured your faculty members to put it into the curriculum. If that's what you want to see, then you pressure them and say, look, incentives matter. This is what I want to see, right? And if they won't, then the easiest thing to do is to write that in and say, I want to see a more richer discussion of the full economy that includes race and inclusiveness. I am officially done talking and will entertain any questions that Matt might have.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, and everyone, please join me in a round of applause. The way we do it virtually is just by putting something in the chat. So thank you very much, Hoove. That was a fantastic talk, and I think the revealed preference of everyone in the session is that they liked it because they stayed until the end. The numbers of participants kept going up, and it maxed at 104, and we're still there. So that's great. So I think I'll start by asking the first question. And while I'm talking, I'll give other people a chance to write their questions in the Q&A, and then I'll go through and take those other questions. So I have several questions, but I'll start with the page you showed about minority economists. And there was maybe like 40 or 50 names on that list. So it was interesting to me. I mentioned in my introductory remarks that I wrote a book on contemporary social controversies. They all use the American Community Survey data. So I searched every study. I actually found one study that talked about discrimination. It was about discrimination against Arab Americans after the September 11th terrorist attack. And it was by Marie Mora, one of the economists on that list. Yep. And it makes me wonder, I think I know the answer, but how do the research agendas of the faculty on that list differ from non-minority economists? And has there been any, analysis of that? Because I think it would be, if not something that we could do, it would be very interesting to know, a little more objectively. But I think I know the answer, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Initially, I didn't do work that had anything to do with race or discrimination or anything, right? I was a public finance guy, and most of my work was centered around the Coase theorem and stuff like that. It was only later on. What you're going to find is, number one, that list is not exhaustive at all. There's well over 450 Black and brown economists in the profession. Our work runs the gamut, but if you're looking for work on discrimination and inclusiveness, then first start on that list, because there is much, much more work. I would go through and look through all of those profiles. Trayvon does a lot of work. I do now. I didn't earlier on. Sandy Darity. There are economists who do this type of work.
Okay, great. Thank you. So going to the Q&A, you showed the figure at the beginning of the talk, and the category all minorities, I think it included Black, Hispanic or Latino, and Native Americans. So does that exclude Asian Americans? And if so, why?
The list is looking at underrepresented minorities, right? So that's what it's not just minorities, it's going to be an underrepresented minority. And in the STEM fields and in economics, Asians are overrepresented as a group, right? Asian Americans are overrepresented. So they wouldn't show up because there is no underrepresentation problem. So sometimes you'll hear the phrase URM, underrepresented minority. That's what we're capturing there.
Great, thank you. And I guess I would just note too that among the category Hispanic and Latino, there are also, many in that category are white as well. So it's hard to measure things precisely. But okay, getting to the next question, our instructor Brian Hurst asks, do you think that race is the only excluded variable in the basic principles definition? In all of my economics classes, it has been made clear that the basic models have many assumptions and that they are the starting point to understand the concepts before complicating them further with additional variables such as race. We then look directly at race in more advanced models.
Yeah, I agree. And it's not just race. I've done work on gender. I've done some other work, but I thought the nature of this talk for tonight was around race. And so that's what I centered in. And I think you're absolutely right that before we can run, we have to learn to walk. So we better start out with some fundamentals, or in other words, principles. And then at the end of the class, but we can't let the class escape without complicating the models. But we have to, even when we start the models, say that these models are incomplete and we have to add to them, right? What I normally tell my students is, if you're building a model airplane, of course, it's not as complex as a real airplane, but it's a starting point, right? It gives us something to then work from. And so I'd agree with that comment, but we have to make it clear that this model is not whole and representative of the bigger picture, which we will try and move to at some point.
Thank you. I believe we have a student asking the next question.
All right.
Do you believe that we can dismantle the neglect of race in economics before we can dismantle the systematic oppression in our country as a whole? And I think maybe this question is maybe gets to the point of how much does it matter that the study of economics gets it right? You know, is the action really in other areas, or can we really change things through economics? I hope I'm not misreading that question, but it had to do with focusing on economics rather than in society as a whole.
They go hand in hand, but let's be clear about one thing. The economics profession has tremendous sway over policymakers. And policymakers in the US listen to economists, right? And if that's going to be the case, if policymakers are going to listen to economists, then economics needs to get it right. And if I were a policymaker, I would have no problems moving on to some other discipline if I were to say, economics or economist, why should I listen to you? You can't even get your own house in order, right? You can't even get it figured out for your profession. Then why should I listen to you to help me try and figure it out for the whole country or for the world for that matter? So I think it's important that economics gets it right because people watch us, right? Policymakers watch us. And if we can't do it right, then they're just going to go on to someone else and we're going to lose the sway we have over policymakers.
Very interesting. Do you think that there are also possibly cultural factors within minority groups that can also be a factor in educational attainment in addition to discrimination?
Well, that's always an argument. That's what we would call statistical discrimination, right? The problem is once you do some high-powered econometrics and not the stuff that I just showed you, the differences still remain. So you can say, well, look, it's cultural and that this group needs to change their cultural norms as such, but we don't see that going the other way, right? And we see that problems still exist. So what we need to do is be clear about where the problems lie. And after you account for almost everything else that you can account for, because economists can't account for everything, we still see these differences existing, and we have to address them. So I would say that that's not going to be enough to explain this difference and to account for what we see.
Okay, there's a simple question, which is for me. Since the webinar is being recorded, will we be able to access the video in the future? And the answer is yes. I put some links in the chat at the beginning. If you joined late, you may not have seen them, but they have been re-chatted a few times. So follow us on Twitter and we'll be posting it there. There's one last question, and we do have about 20 more minutes. So if folks have additional questions, we can take them, or else we'll end it when there are no more questions. So let me ask the last question for now, and we'll see if any more come in. As you stated at the end of your lecture, we need to pressure our professors to create a richer discussion regarding race and economics. But often I find that professors themselves are not educated on the subject. What are ways we can encourage them to be educated?
You can simply ask them to contact me. I am the co-chair of the Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economics Profession. What I do is I hold webinars and seminars to inform faculty about how to educate themselves about exactly these topics. So if you want to see it and you're concerned that your faculty are uninformed themselves, no problem. You say you need to reach out to what's called the SIMGAP, that committee, the Committee on the Status of Minority Groups. Tell your faculty that you want to see this as a part of your learning, of your richer curriculum, they will reach out to me and I will educate them on all I can about where to go, which isn't much different from what you just saw yourself, right? Now they know to go to our website because that's where resources are available, which is what I would have done anyway.
Wonderful, and I'm glad you mentioned the student research competition. We have different programs in our department to help students and encourage them to do research. And in fact, I think this is the one thing that we can do at San Jose State. Our job is to teach students, and by teaching students, we can help the problem by helping them get into the academy and then study those topics that need to be studied. So hopefully one of them in collaboration with faculty can write a paper, and then maybe we can submit it to your journal of Economics, Race, and Policy. That would be a great goal for us here at San Jose State. I do have more questions that came in.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Hoover. How does race relate to the cost of production, the cost curve you mentioned? Are you suggesting that certain races have both positive or negative impacts on how firms can lower costs, increase revenue, generate profits, etc.? If race is an incentive to help with the cost of production, shouldn't we see firms act strongly in response?
No, what I'm saying is that sometimes we cannot just assume that all firms will act solely on the basis of cost. There's something called race-based preferences that firms exhibit that work against their best interest and work against profit maximization. That's why the definition that we use, where we say the firm is only concerned about profit maximization, we can say that that's incomplete. Because if firms were only concerned about profit maximization, then we wouldn't see firms throwing out the resumes of people with Black sounding names. That is not cost efficient, right? If you really only cared about those workers who gave you the lowest cost curves, then we wouldn't see some of the behaviors we see exhibited by firms, which means that they are not acting exactly as that definition said. There's something else going on. And that's what the research is about, to say, this is an incomplete definition of firm behavior. Because if it were, we wouldn't see the Black sounding names. We wouldn't see the preferences towards recently released white criminals as opposed to never incarcerated Black participants. Those things show us that something else is going on, if that makes sense.
It does indeed. And if you have any follow-up questions, you could put them in the Q&A. And I do want to remind participants to put questions in the Q&A, not the chat. I did get one in the chat, and so I will read that. But in the future, put those in Q&A, please. Are there practical steps we as self-governing people can take to our legislative bodies so that we both make our society more meritocratic and less unequal?
Right. Well, first thing we have to do is understand the cost of inequality, because for many economists, we argue that inequality is a sign of growth, right? Any economy that is going to grow unevenly. And so this unequal growth shows that we're having a robust economy. However, there are costs, like I just showed you in that experiment I did. And we have to first, I think, educate our policymakers that, hey, you know what? Yes, there are some goods that come out of this, but there are real substantial costs that we need to be aware of, and we need to take into account when we're talking about growth. And we need to find a way to do what we would call some smoothing, right? So that the inequality wouldn't be as stark, because there are real costs, long-term costs, when people drop out of the labor force, right? And that's why we see these uneven labor force participation rates. And I'm probably getting too technical right now, but when there's a difference in labor force participation, that's a sign, and from my research, in that growing inequality when people are dropping out.
Thank you. We have a question from a professor. What is the most important thing that I can do as an economics professor to help further the cause of racial justice in this country?
Educate yourself so that you can educate your students, right? And that is something that you can look into. This was a faculty member, right?
Yes.
I just wrote a paper that appeared in the JP, the Journal of Economics Perspectives, last summer. It was the summer of 2020, where I did a survey with some other colleagues looking at what caused people to drop out of this profession. So we go and find people who were not only in this profession when dissatisfied, but those for whatever reason who had dropped out of the profession. And we asked them, what caused you to leave? I would encourage you to read that paper as a way of educating yourself about steps that make the environment such that people feel included and welcome.
Thank you very much. I did try to put links in the chat while you were talking, and I'll try to find a way to get some more links out to people when we release the video. Another question from a student: are there any ideas as to how economists of color could be seen in a more colloquial format, similar to how scientists of color are?
Huh. Besides the profiling on the website, or how do we highlight their work, or I'm not quite
sure exactly. I mean, I'm wondering if the question is about basically popularizing economics. And I mean, the type of talk you're giving right now is definitely more colloquial than you would give in a research format.
Yeah. Well,
any ideas there? That was the question.
I think I'm writing a book. In the 1950s, there was this book that came out called The Worldly Philosophers. And if you're as old as I am, you actually had to read that book. And what it talked about, it was a history of economic thought of 10 very prominent economists. All of them were dead, and all of them were white males. So I'm writing a similar book that, just like that one, which was a book written for the popular press, that will highlight the works of Black economists in the way that the Worldly Philosophers did for economics as a whole. And I think that that will be accessible to everyone. It's not going to be written for other economists. It's going to be written for a layperson. And I think those type of efforts are what we're going to see more of.
That's fantastic. I hope we will see more of those. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think although 2020 was a really hard year, it did open people's eyes to things, and I think will mean the demand in the market for the books like that will be bigger than it was before. So there was interest in your experimental study, and
I probably goofed that one a little bit when I talked through it. I went too fast, but
no worries.
Details to it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and before I ask it, I'll just mention we have a new experimental economics lab here at San Jose State, and I put in the chat some information about one of our alums who went on to become a father of experimental economics. So I think there's a lot of interest in this, but the question has to do with why the graphs are different when you looked at wealth versus income.
Precisely that, right? We know that income means that you were working for it, right? Whereas wealth is generally something that can be transgenerational, something that's given to you. And we find that people respond quite differently to holding on to their income than they do to holding on to their wealth, right? That's just a phenomenon that we found about economics in general and wealth in general, that when you have a set income, and you hear people say this all the time, they say, hey, don't cut this or that, I'm on a fixed income. You never hear people say, I'm on a fixed wealth, right? But you will hear people say, I'm on a fixed income. Your income level matters a lot to people in a way that it doesn't when we're talking about your wealth level. And so to make sure that we weren't confusing the two issues, we needed to separate them between income and wealth, right? Because people respond differently to income as opposed to wealth.
Thank you. Great question, great answer. Question about your experience as an instructor. What are misconceptions in terms of knowledge that you have noticed in college economics students? And I suppose your experience teaching at Tulane and University of Oklahoma and during your graduate school, you know, I imagine you had a pretty heavily white student body. And so San Jose State isn't exactly like that. We have, I think, you know, the breakdown is rather different than some of those schools. But tell us a little bit about your experience in terms of the misconceptions you've noticed among your students.
Well, first off, because they've not encountered a faculty member of color at all, for the most part, most of my students, I am the first Black professor they've had, not just in economics, but in their college career, right? And I'll probably be the only one. And what I've come to notice is that at the beginning, students think the class is going to be something different. And then by the end, the most common comment I get is, this guy is just as boring as anyone else, right? He's no better or worse than anybody. And actually, to me, that's sort of the point, right? I'm not supposed to be better or worse. I'm just supposed to be me. And some students find me to be dry and humorless, and I'm just going over supply and demand. Yeah, it is econ. So that probably is the biggest misconception that people start with, and then they walk away with at the end saying, I thought this guy was going to be something different, whether in a good way or in a bad way. They saw me as being different. And then by the end, they walked away saying, he is just another professor. And that's what we want you to see. I'm nothing special. Just another guy doing this. There's no reason why you should not take my class. There's no reason in particular that you should, other than you want the presentation the way that I present it. That's what we've got to get to. We've got to get to the point to where what you care more about is he less boring than Matt? And I don't think that's possible. You know, I am probably the most boring professor you're going to have.
Well, I might give you a run for your money there. I don't know if you've thought about the role of high school and economics education in high school. Student rights, do you think that introducing these concepts to underrepresented students in high school could be a step? As an underrepresented student, economic concepts were not familiar to me. And the topics I was exposed to were STEM because of high school programs. I wonder if maybe STEM programs have made more inroads with high schools than econ.
They have. You know, normally what you'll find at the high school level is econ is a chapter inside of social studies or civics, if they're still doing civics. If you want to know more about high school economics, there's something called the Council of Economic Education, and it's housed in Boston. Find their website, just Google the words Council of Economic Education. What they do is they educate K through 12 teachers on how to present high school economics. They even run a sort of Olympic tournament of high school economics. I've worked with them in the past. I'm not a high school teacher, but the work that they're doing is rather fantastic to get econ into the high schools. Now, that's not me, but I'd absolutely agree with the commenter's suggestion that the sooner you can get people introduced to this, the better off it is. That's why I was introduced to economics as a high school student, and I found it to be something that I gravitated to. So yes, for in my particular case, high school economics is how I ended up being here today.
That's great. I wonder if I could follow up with you on that, because one of my advisors in graduate school said, economists are born economists. And I wonder if you would have found your way to this profession if you didn't have that high school class. What else do you think made you choose this profession?
I really do think at that point, I was looking for answers, and high school economics was the one. I pretty much figured out that I was either going to do law, economics, or politics. Those were the three things that seemed to have been the way to answer the questions which I saw about everyday life. And economics, to me, over the other two, allowed me to be more analytical. So I had some math training and had done pretty well in high school mathematics. Not fantastic, but had done well. And I found that economics, as opposed to law and politics, used the numbers, and that seemed to me to be the way forward for me. Obviously, my initial goal in high school was to be a pro athlete. That didn't work. So this is a nice second best option, but really, I was supposed to have been Michael Jordan, except I ain't have any talent. Only thing that kept me out of the NBA is no talent.
Yes, indeed. Not a bad second option. So I think we have time just for maybe two more questions. There's one more question about high school and whether it's not offered in lower income communities. I guess I'll just give our department one more plug and not ask you the question and say, we have a program here called Step to College, where we work with high school teachers to give college credit for approved high school classes. It's like AP, except not schools in lower income communities don't often have a lot of AP classes. So that's one thing that we're doing at San Jose State to do that. But the last two questions, one is about schools of thought in economics. And here's the question. Given your comments on the failure of economics basic principles models to address irrational behavior like racist hiring practices, do you feel that Austrian economics, which does not assume that individuals behave rationally, falls victim to not addressing race less often than Keynesian economics?
I find that unless all of our schools of thought need to be looked at more closely. And I understand that at the principles levels, we have to get the tools, whether it's Austrian, we have to first build up a tool base to work from. However, I'm not really as concerned about them at the beginning. When you come in, we're assuming all students are blank slates. What I'm concerned about is how the students leave the class. And if they haven't left the class, whether it's Austrian, whether it's Orthodox economics or any other form, if they haven't had this exposure, then I think that they're all missing the point. And well, not missing the point, that they could do better. I think that's probably too strong.
Thank you. And the last question, which presumes that you're a parent. I'm not actually sure if that's true or not, but the question is this: if you are part of an underrepresented minority, what kind of message do you give to your kids to make the numbers better in those charts that you showed?
That we can do better, right? I think the thing that, instead of me talking individually to one person, to talk to all underrepresented minorities, is to take them to the profile page to show that there are many different paths that can lead to a successful career in economics, right? I'm one. I didn't go directly to college, right? I spent 3 years after high school. I spent 3 years in the military before I ever even thought about going back to school. We don't all have to follow that traditional path, and there is a place for us, for everyone in this profession, right? Your voice matters. That's what I've been amazed about. I'm amazed, even sitting here, that San Jose called me up to ask me to give this talk to you tonight, right? They could have picked anybody, but they wanted to hear my voice. That's the point I think I wanted to make, that we all have a chance to have our voice heard. So let's use them, right? The reason, why did I agree to do this? Because I wanted you all to see that my voice can be heard, so that next time your voice can be heard. All of our voices matter. There's room for us.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. I think that's a fantastic way to end it. And I know I speak on behalf of everyone. We really enjoyed your talk. Thanks again for coming. And one final plug, who will be joining us on Friday afternoon for informal discussion. If you haven't signed up for that, we're just going to do informal brief meetings, one at noon for students interested in careers in academia, and then one at 1:30 for faculty. Students are welcome too, to discuss any research or teaching pedagogy, things like that. So no agendas, but you'll have the opportunity to talk face to face in a regular Zoom, not a webinar. So you'll all be able to talk and be seen. So I know it's getting late where you are. Thank you very much again for joining us, especially this late for you. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. And hopefully in person in San Jose, you have a standing invitation. So yes, take us up on that, please.
All right.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. See you
Thank you.
soon.